At 2:17 a.m., three men believed no one was watching. They were wrong. What was captured on a shaky phone that night would expose a family secret so dark it would leave an entire community in shock. This is the story of Deborah, a young woman who trusted the wrong people, a family that turned their backs when she needed them most, and a witness who held the key to justice. But before we continue, let me ask you something. Have you ever trusted someone completely, only to discover they were someone entirely different? Comment below where you're watching from. Stories like this happen everywhere, and awareness saves lives. What happened to Deborah could happen to anyone. It could happen in your neighborhood, in your family, to someone you love. And when you hear what those three men did, you'll understand why some betrayals are so deep they can never be forgiven. 22 years old. That's how old Deborah was when her life changed forever. She wasn't famous, she wasn't wealthy. She was just a regular young woman trying to build a life for herself in a small town where everyone knew everyone. Deborah worked at a local diner on Main Street, the kind of place where the coffee was always hot and the regulars knew your name. She'd been there since she was 19, saving up money for community college. Her dream was to become a nurse. She wanted to help people, to make a difference. Her coworkers remembered her as someone who always had a smile, even on the hardest days. Even when her feet ached from standing for 8 hours straight, even when difficult customers tested her patience, Deborah remained kind. That was just who she was. She lived in a modest apartment above the hardware store on Fifth Avenue. It wasn't much, just a studio with creaky floors and a window that overlooked the street, but it was hers. She decorated it with second-hand furniture and plants she'd bought from the farmer's market. Every Sunday she'd call her mother, and they'd talk for hours about everything and nothing. Deborah was close with her family, or so she thought. Her father had passed away when she was 16, a heart attack that came without warning, and since then, her mother's brothers had stepped in to fill that void. Victor, Dan, and Marcus, her three uncles. They'd been there for every birthday, every holiday, every milestone. When Deborah graduated high school, it was Uncle Victor who stood up and cheered the loudest. When her car broke down last winter, it was Uncle Dan who came to fix it, refusing to let her pay for the repairs. And when she felt lonely in her little apartment, it was Uncle Marcus who'd stop by with takeout and keep her company. To Deborah, they weren't just uncles, they were father figures, protectors, men she trusted with her life. She had no reason to be afraid of them, no reason to question their intentions. They were family, and family meant safety. At least, that's what she believed. Nothing about Deborah suggested she was in danger, especially not from the people she trusted most. She went to work, paid her bills, spent time with friends on weekends. She dated occasionally, though nothing serious. She was focused on her future, on becoming the person she wanted to be. Her best friend, Rachel, would later describe her as someone with a gentle soul, someone who saw the good in people, sometimes too much, someone who believed that family would always have your back. How could she have known that the very people she trusted were hiding something dark? How could anyone know? Before we continue, I want you to think about something. Think about the people you trust most in your life, your family members, your closest friends. Could you ever imagine them hurting you? Could you imagine them planning something so terrible that it would destroy you? Keep that question in mind as we continue Deborah's story. And before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Victor, Dan, and Marcus weren't strangers to the community. In fact, they were well respected.
Victor, the oldest at 48, owned a small construction company that had been operating in town for over 20 years. He employed local workers, paid them fairly, and was known for delivering quality work on time. People trusted him. When the town needed someone to rebuild the community center after the fire 2 years ago, they called Victor. Dan, 45, worked as a mechanic at the auto shop on the edge of town. He had a reputation for being honest, for not overcharging customers, for going the extra mile to help people keep their cars running. Elderly residents would specifically ask for Dan because they knew he wouldn't take advantage of them. And Marcus, 43, was a sales manager at the furniture store downtown. He was charming, friendly, always ready with a joke or a compliment. Customers loved him. His coworkers thought he was a great guy. On the surface, these 3 men seemed like pillars of the community, hard-working, dependable, family-oriented. They attended church occasionally, showed up to town events, coached Little League on weekends. They were the kind of men you'd want as neighbors, as brothers, as uncles. But there were things people didn't see. Small moments that, in hindsight, carried a different weight. Like the way Victor would sometimes look at women in town a little too long. The way Dan's ex-wife had left him years ago without explanation, taking her daughter and refusing contact. The way Marcus had been fired from a previous job under circumstances that were never fully explained, though rumors suggested inappropriate behavior with a female colleague. These were whispers, nothing more, small-town gossip that people dismissed because, well, everyone has their flaws, right? And these men were good to their family. They took care of their sister after her husband died. They stepped up for Deborah. Isn't that what matters? The truth is, predators often hide in plain sight. They build reputations, earn trust, create images of themselves that make people think they could never do something terrible. And that's exactly what makes them so dangerous. Because when someone finally speaks up, when someone finally says something is wrong, the community doesn't want to believe it. They can't believe it. How could Victor, who rebuilt the community center, be capable of something evil? How could Dan, who fixed cars for half the town, hurt someone he's supposed to love? How could Marcus, with his charming smile and friendly demeanor, be anything other than what he appears to be? Deborah saw her uncles the same way everyone else did. She had no reason to think otherwise. When they invited her to family gatherings, she went. When they offered to help her with things around her apartment, she accepted. When they showed up unannounced sometimes, she didn't think it was strange. They were family. They were there for her after her father died. Why would she question their motives? What happened next wasn't sudden. It was slow, quiet, and hidden in plain sight. The warning signs were there, but they were subtle. The way Uncle Victor would sometimes stand too close when they talked. The way Uncle Dan's eyes would linger a moment too long. The way Marcus would make comments about her appearance that felt just slightly off. Comments she'd laugh away because surely he didn't mean anything by it. Surely he was just being nice. Looking back, Deborah's friends would remember moments that felt uncomfortable. Times when the uncles would show up at the diner where Deborah worked, staying longer than necessary, watching her as she moved between tables. Times they'd call her late at night, just to talk, they said, but the conversations would sometimes take turns that felt inappropriate. Deborah brushed it off. They were lonely, she thought. They missed their brother, her father. They just wanted to stay connected. She made excuses for them because she loved them. Because the alternative, the thought that they might have other intentions, was too disturbing to consider. And so life continued. Deborah went to work, saved her money, made plans for her future. The uncles remained fixtures in her life, present and involved, perhaps too involved. The community saw a loving family supporting a young woman who'd lost her father. No one saw what was building beneath the surface. No one knew that something terrible was about to happen. Think about this for a moment. How often do we ignore warning signs because we don't want to believe the worst about people we know? How often do we make excuses for behavior that makes us uncomfortable because confronting it feels too hard, too complicated? This is how abuse happens. This is how people get hurt by the ones who are supposed to protect them. And this is exactly what happened to Deborah. May 15th. It was a Friday night, and Deborah had just finished her shift at the diner. It had been a long week. She was tired, looking forward to going home, taking a hot shower, maybe watching something on TV before bed. Nothing special, just another ordinary night. Or so she thought. Around 10:30 p.m., her phone buzzed. It was Uncle Marcus. He said he was in the neighborhood and wanted to stop by. Said he had something to give her, a gift he'd been meaning to drop off. Deborah hesitated for a moment. She was tired. She just wanted to be alone. But she also didn't want to seem rude. He was family. What harm could it do? She told him it was fine. He could stop by for a few minutes. She unlocked her apartment door, left it slightly open like she always did when expecting someone, and went to change out of her work clothes. She had no idea that Uncle Victor and Uncle Dan were with Marcus. She had no idea that all three of them were coming. She had no idea that this night would be the night her life shattered into pieces. When she heard footsteps on the stairs, she called out, thinking it was just Marcus. But when she stepped into the living room, all three uncles were there, standing in her small apartment, the door closed behind them. Something in the air felt different, wrong. Deborah's smile faded. She asked them what they were doing there, why they'd all come. Uncle Victor said they just wanted to check on her, make sure she was okay. Uncle Dan added that they'd been worried about her, working so hard, living alone. Uncle Marcus stepped closer, too close. Deborah took a step back. Her instinct told her something wasn't right, but her mind struggled to catch up. These were her uncles, her family. They wouldn't hurt her, would they? She told them she was fine, that she appreciated them checking on her, but she was really tired and needed to get some rest. She tried to move toward the door, tried to usher them out politely, but Uncle Victor blocked her path. His expression had changed. The warmth was gone. In its place was something cold, something calculating. Deborah's heart started to race. She asked them again to leave. Her voice was firmer now, more insistent. She told them they were making her uncomfortable. Uncle Dan moved closer to her. Uncle Marcus stood by the window, watching, blocking any view from the street outside. What happened next, what those three men did to Deborah in her own apartment, the place she thought was safe, it's something that cannot be described in detail here. Not because we're avoiding the truth, but because some acts of violence are so terrible, so invasive, so dehumanizing, that to describe them in detail would only serve to cause more harm. What you need to understand is this. Deborah begged them to stop. She fought as hard as she could. She screamed, but her apartment was above a hardware store that was closed for the night, and the neighboring buildings were too far away for anyone to hear. The violation went on for hours. Three men who were supposed to protect her, who were supposed to be her family, took turns destroying her sense of safety, her trust, her very sense of self. By the time they finally left, it was after 2 a.m. Deborah lay on her apartment floor, broken and bleeding. She couldn't move, she couldn't speak, she couldn't even cry. The shock was too profound. Her mind had shut down, unable to process what had just happened. She never made it home that night. In a way, home didn't exist anymore. The place she'd built for herself, the little studio apartment she'd decorated with such care, had become a crime scene, a place of horror. And the men who had done this to her, they believed they'd gotten away with it. They believed because they were family, because they held a certain status in the community, because Deborah had no proof, no evidence, just her word, they believed they were untouchable. They believed wrong. I want to pause here and ask you something. How would you feel if this happened to someone you love, your sister, your daughter, your friend? What would you want done to the people who hurt them? Keep that in your mind as we continue. The next morning, Victor, Dan, and Marcus went about their lives as if nothing had happened. Victor showed up at his construction site, barking orders at his crew, reviewing blueprints for a new project. Dan opened the auto shop right on time, greeting customers with his usual friendly demeanor, sliding under cars to diagnose problems. Marcus arrived at the furniture store, straightening his tie, flashing that charming smile at everyone who walked through the door. They believed the night would erase itself. They had planned it that way. Not explicitly, perhaps. There had been no grand conspiracy, no detailed scheme laid out on paper, but there had been an understanding between them, an unspoken agreement that had been building for months. They'd noticed how isolated Deborah was, how she lived alone, how she trusted them implicitly, how no one would believe her if she spoke up, because they were established men in the community, and she was just a young woman working at a diner. Who would believe? 3 established men with decades of reputation behind them, or a girl with no proof, no evidence, just her word? In their minds, they'd taken a calculated risk, and it had paid off. They'd satisfied whatever twisted urges had been festering inside them, and now they could move on, confident that their secret was safe. They even texted each other that afternoon, casual messages, making plans to watch the game that weekend, discussing a fishing trip they wanted to take. Nothing about what they'd done, nothing about Deborah, as if she didn't matter, as if she was nothing. Meanwhile, Deborah hadn't left her apartment. She'd managed to pull herself off the floor sometime around dawn, her body screaming in pain with each movement. She'd crawled to the bathroom and sat in the shower for over an hour, letting the water run over her, trying to wash away the feeling of their hands on her body. But no amount of soap or water could make her feel clean. She called in sick to work. Her manager, concerned because Deborah never missed shifts, asked if she was okay. Deborah said she was just tired, just needed a day to rest. She couldn't form the words to explain what had really happened. She was in shock, still trying to understand it herself. Part of her couldn't believe that it had actually happened. Her uncles, the men she loved, the men she trusted, they couldn't have done this. It must have been a nightmare, a terrible, horrible nightmare. But the bruises on her body told a different story. The pain between her legs was real. The shattered lamp on her living room floor was real. This wasn't a nightmare. This was her new reality. Days passed. Deborah barely ate. She couldn't sleep, and when she did, she woke up screaming. She stopped answering her phone. She stopped going to work. Her manager called, worried, and Deborah told her she had the flu. She couldn't tell her mother the truth. How could she? These were her mother's brothers. It would destroy her.
The uncles, emboldened by Deborah's silence, began to relax. They'd check in with each other, smirking, joking about that night in subtle ways that no one else would understand. They felt invincible. They felt like they'd gotten away with murder. In a sense, they had, because the Deborah who existed before that night was gone. In her place was a shell of a person, trapped in an apartment that felt like a prison, reliving her trauma every time she closed her eyes. Can you imagine what that silence cost her? Can you imagine having to carry a secret so heavy, so painful, that it threatens to crush you every single day? This is what sexual assault survivors face. The fear, the shame, the knowledge that speaking up might not change anything, might only make things worse. And for Deborah, things were about to change in a way no one expected. His name was Michael. 28 years old, worked night shifts at the warehouse district, usually got off around 2 a.m. He lived in an apartment building across the street from Deborah's place. Normally, Michael would just head straight home, exhausted from work, wanting nothing more than to sleep.
But on the night of May 15th, he'd stopped at the convenience store on the corner to grab a soda and some chips. It was 2:17 a.m. when he started walking back to his building. That's when he saw them. 3 men leaving the building across the street. They were laughing, joking, patting each other on the back. There was something about the scene that struck Michael as odd. The time of night, the way they moved, quick and furtive despite their laughter. The way they kept looking around, as if checking to make sure no one was watching. Michael slowed his pace. Something in his gut told him this wasn't right. He'd seen crime shows, he'd heard stories about things that happened in the city, and something about these 3 men set off alarm bells in his head. Without really thinking about it, Michael pulled out his phone. The camera was already open because he'd been taking pictures of street art earlier that night. He hit record. The video was shaky, the lighting was poor, the men were across the street, but he captured them, their faces, their voices, the way they moved. He caught them getting into a truck, the license plate clearly visible in his frame. He recorded them as they drove away, and only then did he lower his phone, his heart pounding. He stood there for a moment, unsure what he'd just witnessed. Had he seen something criminal, or was he overreacting? Maybe those guys had just been visiting someone. Maybe they worked late, too. Maybe he was being paranoid. Michael went home. He couldn't sleep. The video stayed on his phone. He thought about deleting it, thought about minding his own business, but something wouldn't let him. 2 days later, Michael saw something that made his blood run cold. He was taking out his trash when he glanced across the street at Deborah's building. Her curtains were usually open, letting in light, but for the past 2 days they'd been closed, and that morning he saw her. Just for a moment, Deborah opened her curtains slightly, and Michael got a glimpse of her face. Even from across the street, even through the distance and the glass, he could see that something was terribly wrong. Her face was pale, gaunt. She looked like someone who'd seen a ghost, or worse. That's when Michael made the connection. The 3 men leaving her building at 2:17 a.m., the way they'd been laughing, the way Deborah now looked like a shadow of a person. Something had happened that night, something terrible, and he had evidence. The weight of that realization pressed down on Michael like a physical force. He had a decision to make. He could delete the video, forget what he'd seen, go about his life. After all, he didn't know these people. He didn't know what had really happened. It wasn't his business. He could stay safe, uninvolved, unburdened by someone else's tragedy. Or he could speak up. He could take that video to the police. He could be a witness. But what if he was wrong? What if nothing bad had happened? What if those men were innocent and he was accusing them of something terrible based on nothing but a gut feeling? What if they came after him? What if he put himself in danger for no reason? These thoughts kept Michael awake for another night. He paced his apartment. He looked at the video again and again. He thought about that girl across the street, the one with the haunted eyes. And finally, he made his choice. That single decision changed everything. Michael walked into the police station on a Monday morning. He told the officer at the desk that he might have evidence related to a crime, though he wasn't sure what crime. He explained what he'd seen, what he'd recorded. The officer took his statement, reviewed the video, and Michael could see the expression on the officer's face shift. This was serious. This was real. Within hours, detectives were involved. They brought Michael in for a proper interview, took a copy of his video, analyzed it frame by frame. They ran the license plate. The truck was Victor's. They enhanced the images, confirmed the identities of all 3 men, and then they went to Deborah's apartment. When Deborah opened her door and saw police officers standing there, she almost collapsed. For a moment, she thought they were coming to arrest her, some irrational part of her mind convinced she'd done something wrong. But then they told her why they were there. They told her about Michael, about the video, about the evidence, and they asked her the question she'd been too afraid to answer. Did something happen to you on the night of May 15th? Deborah broke down. Everything she'd been holding inside for days came pouring out. The fear, the shame, the pain. She told them what her uncles had done, every horrible detail. And for the first time since that night, she wasn't alone with her secret anymore. If you're still watching, comment "Justice for Deborah." It helps this story reach more people who need to hear it, because stories like this don't just happen in movies or on TV. They happen in real life, in small towns and big cities, to people who never thought it could happen to them. And sometimes, justice only comes when someone brave enough decides to speak up. The police moved quickly. Within 24 hours of Michael coming forward, they had launched a full investigation. Deborah was taken to the hospital for a sexual assault examination. Even though several days had passed since the attack, medical professionals were able to document injuries consistent with her account. Bruising, tearing, evidence that couldn't be explained away. Detectives obtained warrants for the DNA of Victor, Dan, and Marcus. They seized Victor's truck, the same one from Michael's video. They combed through phone records, text messages, and anything else that might corroborate Deborah's story. The video Michael had captured became the linchpin of the case. It placed all three men at Deborah's apartment at the exact time she said the assault occurred. It showed them leaving together, relaxed, even celebratory. It contradicted any potential claim they might make about not being there, about having alibis, about being somewhere else. The evidence was building, but the real challenge was about to begin.
Because in a small town where everyone knows everyone, where Victor, Dan, and Marcus were respected and liked, the accusations sent shockwaves through the community. On Wednesday, exactly 1 week after the assault, police arrested all three men. Victor was taken from his construction site in handcuffs in full view of his employees. Dan was arrested at the auto shop in the middle of working on a customer's car. Marcus was led out of the furniture store in cuffs, past customers and co-workers who stood in stunned silence. The charges were serious: sexual assault, conspiracy, criminal restraint. Each man faced decades in prison if convicted. News spread through the town like wildfire. People couldn't believe it. Victor? Dan? Marcus? Those three? The guys who coached Little League? Who helped neighbors? Who were pillars of the community? There had to be some mistake, some misunderstanding. Within hours, a different narrative began to emerge. People started whispering that maybe Deborah was lying. Maybe she was confused. Maybe she'd had a consensual encounter with one of them and now regretted it. Maybe she was after money. Maybe she had some other motive. After all, these were good men. Upstanding men. Why would they risk everything to hurt their own niece? It didn't make sense to the townspeople who'd known them for years. The local newspaper ran a story with the headline, "3 local men arrested in alleged assault case." The word alleged stood out, emphasized. The article was careful not to take sides, but the subtext was clear. These were allegations, not facts. These men deserved the presumption of innocence. Deborah's mother was devastated. When police told her what had happened, what her brothers had done to her daughter, she couldn't process it. She refused to believe it at first. Her brothers, her family. No, there had to be another explanation. She called each of them in jail. She listened to their denials, their claims that this was all a mistake, that Deborah was confused or lying, and for a brief moment, she didn't know who to believe, her daughter or her brothers. How do you choose between your child and your family? But then she saw Deborah. She saw the look in her daughter's eyes, the way she flinched at sudden movements, the way she couldn't stop shaking when she talked about that night. And a mother knows. A mother knows when her child is telling the truth. She chose Deborah. She believed her. Not everyone did. The community divided. Some people stood by the three men, organizing fundraisers for their legal defense, making posts on social media about how they were being railroaded by a broken justice system. Others stood by Deborah, though they did so more quietly, aware that defending her meant going against some of the most prominent families in town. The investigation continued. Detectives interviewed everyone who knew the three men. They looked for patterns of behavior, for other potential victims, for anything that might support or contradict the
the charges. They found things, small things. A former employee at Dan's shop who said he'd made inappropriate comments to her years ago. A woman who'd gone on a date with Marcus once and said he'd been aggressive when she'd refused to come home with him. A neighbor who said Victor had been fired from a job 20 years ago, though no one could remember why. None of it was enough to prove guilt in this case, but it painted a picture of three men who were not quite as upstanding as everyone thought. And then there was Michael's video, played on a loop in the detective's office, analyzed by experts, enhanced, verified. That video was irrefutable. It showed three men leaving the scene of a crime, and combined with Deborah's testimony, with the medical evidence, with the phone records that showed the men had been in contact with each other that night, it built a case that was strong enough to move forward. The district attorney announced that all three men would be tried together. The trial was set for 4 months away, and Deborah, still recovering from the worst night of her life, now had to prepare for another ordeal. She had to prepare to face her abusers in court. How do you think you'd handle something like this? If you were Deborah, could you find the strength to stand up in front of a courtroom and relive your trauma, knowing that your uncles, your family, would be sitting right there, knowing that people in the community you'd lived in your whole life might not believe you? It takes a kind of courage most of us can't even imagine. The trial began on a cold Monday morning in September. The courthouse was packed. Media had picked up the story, and reporters from neighboring cities had come to cover what was being called the trial of the decade for this small town. Deborah sat in the front row with her mother and Rachel, her best friend. She'd lost weight since May. Her hair, once long and carefully maintained, was now pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore minimal makeup. She looked fragile, but there was something steely in her eyes, a determination that hadn't been there before. Across the aisle sat Victor, Dan, and Marcus with their defense attorneys. All three men had been released on bail, a decision that had infuriated Deborah, but was legally sound, given their ties to the community and lack of prior criminal records. They wore suits. They looked respectable, professional, like men who could never commit such heinous acts. The prosecution's case was methodical and thorough. They started with Michael, the witness. He testified about what he'd seen that night, about why he'd decided to record, about his decision to come forward. The defense attorneys tried to paint him as an unreliable narrator, someone who'd misinterpreted what he'd seen, who had no real knowledge of what had happened inside the apartment. But Michael stood firm. He knew what he'd seen. He knew it was wrong. Then came the medical examiner, who testified about Deborah's injuries, about the physical evidence that corroborated her account. The defense tried to suggest that the injuries could have been from consensual activity, that rough sex could explain the bruising, the tearing. It was a disgusting line of questioning, one that made Deborah feel violated all over again. But the medical examiner shut it down. The injuries, she testified, were consistent with forcible assault, not consensual activity. Phone records were entered into evidence, showing that Victor, Dan, and Marcus had all been in contact with each other that night, that they'd coordinated their meeting, that they were near Deborah's apartment at the exact time she said they were. The defense argued coincidence. The prosecution argued coordination. And then it was Deborah's turn. She took the stand on the 4th day of the trial. Her mother squeezed her hand before she stood up, whispering, "You can do this." Deborah walked to the witness stand, her legs shaking, and swore to tell the truth. For the next 3 hours, she did exactly that. She told the jury about her relationship with her uncles, about how she trusted them, about the night of May 15th. She described what they did to her in painful, excruciating detail. She cried. She had to pause multiple times to collect herself, but she never wavered. She looked at the jury, not at her uncles, and she told them everything. The defense attorneys cross-examined her aggressively. They asked why she didn't report the assault immediately, why she didn't fight harder, why she'd let them into her apartment in the first place. They tried to suggest she'd consented and then regretted it, that she was making it all up, that she had some ulterior motive, some reason to destroy these men's lives. Deborah answered every question. She explained the shock, the trauma, the fear. She explained how abuse victims often don't report immediately because they're trying to process what happened. She explained that she trusted her uncles because they were family, and trusting family isn't a crime.
By the time she stepped down from the stand, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. Well, almost. Victor, Dan, and Marcus sat stone-faced, unmoved, as if none of this had anything to do with them. But the betrayal didn't end in the courtroom. In the hallways during breaks, members of Victor's, Dan's, and Marcus's families confronted Deborah. Some called her a liar. Others said she was tearing the family apart. One cousin even said that she should be ashamed of herself for putting their uncles through this. Deborah's own grandmother, her father's mother, refused to speak to her. She'd chosen her sons over her granddaughter. She couldn't believe that the boy she'd raised could do something so terrible. It was easier to believe that Deborah was lying. The town remained divided. Some rallied around Deborah, organizing a support group for sexual assault survivors, holding vigils outside the courthouse. Others stood by the three men, insisting they were innocent until proven guilty, questioning why a young woman's word should be enough to destroy 3 lives. Deborah was subjected to harassment on social media. Anonymous accounts called her names, accused her of seeking attention, threatened her. She had to delete all her accounts, disconnect from the online world entirely. The stress took a toll. She couldn't eat. She couldn't sleep. She developed panic attacks that would come out of nowhere, leaving her gasping for breath, certain she was dying. But she kept going, because she knew the truth, and she knew that staying silent would mean letting her abusers win. The prosecution rested their case after 8 days of testimony. The defense put on their case, calling character witnesses who testified about what good men Victor, Dan, and Marcus were, how they'd helped people, how they were devoted family members, how this accusation was completely out of character. None of the 3 men took the stand. Their attorneys advised them not to, a strategic decision that many interpreted as an admission of guilt. After all, if they were innocent, wouldn't they want to tell their side of the story? The closing arguments were fierce. The prosecution painted a picture of 3 predators who'd taken advantage of a vulnerable young woman, who'd planned their attack, who'd believed they were above the law. The defense argued reasonable doubt, claiming that the evidence was circumstantial, that Deborah's testimony was uncorroborated, that Michael's video didn't prove anything except that 3 men had visited their niece. The jury deliberated for 2 days, 2 long, agonizing days where Deborah could barely breathe, waiting to hear if justice would be served. Even after her death, Deborah had to be defended, even after everything she'd endured, even after laying bare her trauma in front of strangers, she still had to fight to be believed. What does that say about us as a society? What does it say when a victim has to prove they were hurt, when the benefit of the doubt goes to the accused, when family ties and community standing matter more than truth? These are questions we all need to ask ourselves. Before we continue with the verdict, let's talk about something important, something that might help you understand why Deborah's story matters and why it happens more often than you think. Betrayal trauma. That's what psychologists call it when someone you trust, someone who's supposed to protect you, becomes your abuser. It's one of the most devastating forms of trauma because it doesn't just hurt your body, it destroys your ability to trust, your sense of safety, your understanding of the world. When a stranger attacks you, it's horrifying, but when a family member does it, someone you've known your entire life, someone you've laughed with, celebrated holidays with, turned to for help, it shatters something fundamental in your psyche. Statistics tell us that approximately 60% of sexual assault victims know their attacker. 60%. That means the majority of sexual assaults aren't committed by strangers in dark alleys. They're committed by boyfriends, dates, co-workers, acquaintances, and yes, family members. But we don't talk about this enough. We don't want to believe that the people we know, the people we love, could be capable of such violence. So we create narratives that protect us from that
uncomfortable truth. We say things like, "He's always been so nice to me," or "I've known him for years, he'd never do that." And in doing so, we inadvertently silence victims. Because when someone finally speaks up about being assaulted by a person everyone knows and likes, they're met with disbelief, with skepticism, with accusations that they must be lying or confused or seeking attention. This is especially true in cases of familial abuse. Family is supposed to be sacred. Family is supposed to be safe. So when someone breaks that trust, when they violate that sacred bond, it's easier for others to blame the victim than to accept that evil can exist within families we thought we knew. Deborah experienced this firsthand. Even after presenting evidence, even after testifying, even after medical professionals confirmed her injuries, people still questioned her, still defended her abusers. Why? Because accepting the truth meant accepting that they'd been wrong about Victor, Dan, and Marcus. It meant accepting that they'd trusted predators. It meant accepting that they'd failed to protect Deborah. And that's a heavy burden to carry. So instead, they blamed her. They said she should have known better, should have fought harder, should have reported immediately, should have, as if there's a right way to respond to being attacked by the people you trust most. Here's what you need to understand. There is no right way to respond to trauma. Some people fight, some people freeze, some people dissociate, mentally checking out to protect themselves from the horror of what's happening. Some people report immediately, others take days, weeks, months, even years. None of these responses mean the assault didn't happen. They're just different ways the human brain tries to cope with something incomprehensible. And victims stay silent for many reasons: fear that they won't be believed, fear of retaliation, fear of losing their family, their community, their support system, shame, even though they have nothing to be ashamed of, guilt, even though they did nothing wrong, confusion about whether what happened really qualifies as assault, especially if it's someone they know and trust. This is why awareness matters. This is why stories like Deborah's need to be told. Because for every person who thinks, "This could never happen in my family," there's a victim silently suffering, believing they're alone, believing no one will believe them, believing they somehow deserved what happened. They didn't. Deborah didn't. No one ever deserves to be violated. No one ever asks for it, and no one should have to prove they didn't want it. The warning signs of familial abuse are often subtle: inappropriate comments disguised as jokes, boundary violations disguised as affection, controlling behavior disguised as care. And because these behaviors come from people we trust, we make excuses for them. We tell ourselves we're overreacting. We convince ourselves it's not that bad. But sometimes it is that bad. Sometimes those small violations are building towards something bigger, something dangerous. If you're watching this and something about Deborah's story resonates with you, if you've experienced something similar or know someone who has, please understand this: it's not your fault. It never was your fault, and you deserve to be believed. You deserve support. You deserve justice. There are resources available: hotlines, support groups, therapists who specialize in trauma. You don't have to carry this alone. And if you're someone who knows a survivor, believe them. Don't question them. Don't ask why they didn't fight back or report sooner. Just believe them. Your belief might be the first step in their healing. Now, let's return to Deborah's story. Let's talk about what happened when that jury finally came back with their verdict. On the third day of deliberations, at 3:47 p.m., the jury sent word that they'd reached a verdict. The courthouse, which had emptied out slightly during the wait, filled again within an hour. Deborah sat between her mother and Rachel, holding both their hands so tightly her knuckles turned white. She couldn't look at her uncles, couldn't bear to see their faces. The judge entered. Everyone stood, then sat. The tension in the room was suffocating. The jury foreman, a retired teacher in his 60s, stood when asked if they'd reached a verdict. He said they had. The judge asked him to read it. For the charge of sexual assault in the first degree against Victor, how do you find? Guilty. Deborah gasped. Her mother started crying. In the back of the courtroom, someone shouted no. For the charge of sexual assault in the first degree against Dan, how do you find? Guilty. For the charge of sexual assault in the first degree against Marcus, how do you find? Guilty. All 3 men were found guilty on all counts: conspiracy, criminal restraint, multiple counts of sexual assault. The courtroom erupted. Some people cheered, others wept. Victor's wife screamed that this was a miscarriage of justice. Dan's sister stood up and walked out, slamming the door behind her. Marcus just sat there, staring straight ahead, as if he couldn't quite believe what was happening. The judge banged his gavel, calling for order. He thanked the jury for their service and scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later. Then he remanded all 3 men to custody. No more bail. They were led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, and this time they didn't look so respectable. They looked like what they were: criminals, predators, men who'd finally been held accountable for their actions. Deborah collapsed in her seat. The relief was overwhelming. For months she'd been living in fear that they'd be acquitted, that she'd have to see them walking free in her town, that her trauma would be dismissed as fiction. But the jury had believed her. 12 strangers had listened to her story and decided she was telling the truth. That validation, after everything she'd been through, was profound. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Deborah's attorney made a brief statement, thanking the jury, the prosecution, and most importantly, Michael, the witness whose video had made justice possible. Michael, who'd been in the courtroom every day, gave a statement of his own. He said he'd simply done what anyone should do when they see something wrong. He'd spoken up. He encouraged others to do the same, to not look away when they witness injustice, to not stay silent when they have information that could help someone, because silence, he said, protects abusers. Only truth protects victims. 6 weeks later, at the sentencing hearing, all 3 men were given the maximum sentences allowed by law. Victor received 45 years. Dan received 42 years. Marcus received 40 years. They would all be eligible for parole, but not for decades. By the time they got out, if they got out, they'd be old men. Their lives, as they'd known them, were over. Deborah gave a victim impact statement at the sentencing. She stood before the court and told her uncles exactly what they'd taken from her: her sense of safety, her ability to trust, her relationship with parts of her family who'd chosen them over her, her innocence, her peace of mind. But she also told them what they hadn't taken: her strength, her resilience, her determination to survive. She said she'd spent months feeling like a victim, feeling weak and broken. But standing there, watching them be sentenced, she realized something. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was a survivor, and she was going to use her story to help others. The courtroom was silent when she finished. Even the judge had tears in his eyes. He told Deborah her courage was extraordinary, that she'd done something incredibly difficult, and that he hoped she found peace. Then he told Victor, Dan, and Marcus that they'd betrayed Deborah, not just Deborah, but the entire concept of family, that they'd used their positions of trust to commit unspeakable acts, and that they deserved every year of their sentences. They were led away. Deborah watched them go, and for the first time in months, she felt like she could breathe. The town slowly began to heal. The division didn't disappear overnight. Some people still believed the 3 men had been wrongly convicted, though their numbers dwindled as more details emerged, as the full evidence became public record, as the truth became undeniable. Others apologized to Deborah, people who'd questioned her, who'd defended her uncles, who'd made her feel like she was the one on trial. Some apologies she accepted, others she didn't. That was her right. Deborah moved away from the town 6 months after the trial. She couldn't stay there, in the place where it happened, where everyone knew her story, where she couldn't walk down the street without someone staring at her with either pity or judgment. She moved to a city 3 hours away, started over, enrolled in college, pursuing that nursing degree she'd always wanted. It wasn't easy. She had PTSD, nightmares, triggers that would come out of nowhere. But she got therapy. She joined a support group. She learned to live with what had happened without letting it define her entire existence. She stayed in touch with Michael, the witness. They became friends, bonded by the shared experience of that trial. He'd been harassed too, called a snitch, told he should have minded his own business, but he never regretted coming forward. He saved Deborah's life, in a way, not physically, but spiritually. He gave her justice when she thought justice was impossible. Deborah's relationship with her mother was complicated after the trial. Her mother had believed her, had stood by her, but she'd also lost her brothers. She grieved them, even knowing what they'd done. That grief sometimes made Deborah feel guilty, even though she knew she shouldn't. It took time and therapy for both of them to navigate those complicated feelings, but they did. They rebuilt their relationship, found a new normal. 3 years after the trial, Deborah graduated with her nursing degree. She specialized in emergency care and made it her mission to treat sexual assault victims with the compassion and respect she'd received from the medical staff who'd examined her. She became an advocate, speaking at schools and community centers about consent, about believing survivors, about the warning signs of abuse. She turned her trauma into purpose. And while she still had bad days, days when the memories felt too heavy to carry, she also had good days, days when she laughed, days when she felt hope, days when she remembered who she was before that night and reclaimed pieces of that person. Deborah's story isn't just about what happened to her, it's about what happened after, about choosing to survive, to fight, to speak up even when it's terrifying, and about the difference one person, one witness, one moment of courage can make. Deborah trusted her family, and that trust cost her everything: her sense of safety, her innocence, her belief that family would always protect her. But in losing everything, she found something too. She found her voice. She found her strength. She found the courage to stand up and say, "This happened to me, and it was wrong, and I deserve justice." Michael trusted his instincts. He trusted that what he'd witnessed was wrong, even when he could have looked away, even when staying silent would have been easier. He chose to speak up.
And because of that choice, three predators were held accountable. This story is real. The details have been changed to protect privacy, but stories like this happen every single day. In small towns and big cities, to people who never thought it could happen to them, to victims who are silenced by shame, by fear, by communities that choose to protect abusers instead of survivors. So I want to ask you something. Should family ties ever protect criminals? Should we give people a pass on horrific behavior because they're related to us, because we've known them for years, because they seem like good people? Or should we believe survivors? Should we hold people accountable no matter who they are? Comment below. Tell us what you think. And if this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you that we all have a responsibility to speak up when we see something wrong, then share this video. Because awareness saves lives. Because believing survivors saves lives. Because teaching people about consent, about boundaries, about the warning signs of abuse, it saves lives. Deborah is still out there, living her life, healing from what happened. She'll never be the same person she was before that night. Trauma changes you. But she's proof that survival is possible, that justice is possible, that even when the people who are supposed to love you betray you in the worst way imaginable, you can still find a way forward. To everyone watching who's survived something similar, who's carried a secret they were too afraid to share, who's wondered if anyone would believe them, you are not alone. Your story matters, your pain is valid, and you deserve to be heard. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. Thank you for being the kind of person who doesn't look away from uncomfortable truths.
If you believe awareness saves lives, subscribe to this channel, share this video, and never stop speaking up for those who can't speak for themselves. Because in the end, that's how we change things. One story at a time, one survivor at a time, one witness at a time. Justice for Deborah, justice for all survivors.